Hey, this is Mr. Armand, and we are going to be talking today about starting off with cells and energy. Our focus for this chapter is essentially going to revolve around ATP production and usage. We're going to talk about photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and then we'll hit a few topics in fermentation. The chapter kind of goes in an overview and then in detail over both photosynthesis and cell respiration. And so we're going to touch bases on both. We're going to give you both an overview first, and then we'll hit some of the more important parts of it in detail as we go along. Something that you're going to want to review before you start Chapter 4 is you're going to want to look at, back in Chapter 2 we talked about bond energy. And how that is important, what a covalent bond is. You're going to need to review what endothermic and exothermic means. And then going into Chapter 3, you're going to want to know the function of the chloroplast and the mitochondria. Both of those are going to be put into play in this chapter. And so, let's look a little bit about each one of these real fast. So you ever wonder why some people really have to watch their weight, and they can only eat just a couple things, and they have to count the calories and all that stuff, and then some people could just eat just about anything and never gain a pound. You've heard the term metabolism before, but what it really is metabolism, that's something that we have to kind of get into and talk about a little bit. What does it actually mean? The next thing I really want you to consider is, you've seen these Ironman triathlons, and you've heard of marathon runners and things like that, and maybe a few of you are actually involved in athletic competitions and things like that. So I want you to think about this. What makes an athlete? And I kind of put a few terms up there so you can consider. First thing, metabolism, what we threw out there. What is that? Endurance, energy, exercise, practice. All of these things, I want you to think about, how does that really make an athlete, or does it make an athlete at all? So think about that for just a moment while I pause and let you collect your thoughts here. Alright, so hopefully you've thought about this. And the first term here, metabolism. So let's look at that. Well, metabolism essentially is just all the chemical processes that an organism undergoes. So the chemical reactions that's going on inside of an organism, how those chemicals are being broken down and sorted throughout the body, converted into other chemicals that the body can use. And then the next thing is something called endurance. You've ever wondered why some people can run long distances, and some people, they, after maybe about a meter or 2 meters of running, they start getting out of breath? Well, you have a factor called endurance, and that endurance can play a role too. And essentially, that endurance boils down to a topic that we'll talk about. I mean, everything in here is essentially connected. You have endurance, energy. Energy is what we use as fuel to get things moving. And so energy is a factor that could involve making an athlete. Exercise, well, continuous exercise, we say, helps build muscle, and things like that. Well, you get down to what's going on the cellular level, what is happening whenever you're building that muscle. Like I said, the big breakthrough is that all these things are connected, and practice. Well, practice is just that repetition going over and over again with that exercise. So, essentially, probably going to hate me for this, but what makes an athlete? Well, essentially it all boils down to your ability to use a chemical or process a chemical known as ATP. ATP stands for adenosine. I'll try to spell it with this. Adenosine. I don't really have a mouse on this. I did using my touchpad. Adenosine. And then try. Phosphate. And this big long word. Phosphate. Okay, adenosine triphosphate. All that just to spell the word. Now you know how it's spelled. So what is this adenosine triphosphate? Well, adenosine is essentially this combination of this molecule here. So of that ATP molecule, adenosine is this portion. This portion is known as the adenine. So adenine is this portion right here, these two ring structures, and then you have a ribose sugar, which is this guy right here. So that is the ribose sugar. Remember, anything that ends in OSE is a sugar molecule. Cellulose or glucose or fructose, anything that ends in OSE is a sugar molecule. When we get to DNA, deoxyribose is a sugar molecule as well. So just to remind you, but the adenosine is a combination of both adenine, this, plus the sugar molecule, ribose. The other component of ATP is essentially these three, 1, 2, 3 phosphate molecules. There are 3 phosphates, and essentially that third phosphate, whenever you tack on this last one, it makes it a very high energy molecule. And whenever you break off that phosphate, you are releasing a tremendous amount of energy. There's essentially just too much energy stored in this one molecule, and whenever that last bond is broken, you release a tremendous amount of energy. So ATP, just to recap, is adenosine here, triphosphate, or 3 phosphates. And so let's kind of rewind here. Where is the energy stored in a chemical? Well, if you remember back from chapter 2, chemical energy is stored inside bonds. And so here, inside each one of these little lines, that line right there is a bond. This is a bad looking bond. Okay, bond. Alright, this energy is stored in bonds, and these are covalent bonds. If you remember back in chapter 2, we said covalent bonds are bonds. So covalent bonds let's put cove. Covalent bonds are bonds that are formed whenever you have sharing of electrons between two atoms. So you have those sharing of electrons that forming that covalent bond, and energy is captured within that bond. So those electrons are being stored. That's the energy. And that third phosphate, whenever it's added in, that produces a tremendous amount of energy. It's stored inside this molecule known as ATP. So you see the ATP molecule here? This is a charged ATP. Think of it as a full battery, if you will. Whenever you remove that phosphate or break that phosphate, it's like tapping into that battery there and releases amount of energy. So that energy is being released, and then that phosphate's removed. You're only left with two phosphates after that third one's been broken off, and that is ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. So diphosphate because there's two phosphates. The ADP is a low energy molecule, and so it's nice and stable the way it is, and it doesn't want to give up any energy at this point. So this is a nice way of kind of storing up energy for our bodies and all living organisms essentially, is in this form of ATP. So let's look at something that you might be a little bit more familiar with. Hopefully you remember this back from chapter 2 when we talked about chemical energy and bond energy. Remember we said that reactants on we're looking at a chemical reaction. Reactants are always on the left-hand side of the equation, and then we have usually an arrow that goes across, and then you have reactants forming products. Products are what you get at the end. So reactants are what you start with, and then you have some sort of chemical change, and that forms your products. So reactants here, in this graph that you see, notice that you have energy over on the left-hand side of the graph, and you have the progress of the reaction, or the time of the reaction, going on the bottom. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that this point right here in time, there is this much energy. There is a whatever this amount of energy is right here, there's that much energy stored inside that molecule. Whenever that energy is added to a reaction, and energy, always remember, it has to be added to a reaction for it to go from reactants to products. It could be a large amount of energy, it could be a small amount of energy, but energy is always added. So whenever you add energy, you overcome this activation energy complex that you have right here. Then at that point, energy is being released. And if by chance you release more energy than what you started with, then you have a reaction known as an exothermic reaction. Exothermic means that energy is being released into the surroundings from the reaction itself. And so if I had to ask you a question, between ATP and ADP, which one would have more energy? So would ATP be on this side, or ADP be on this side, and then vice versa, would ATP or ADP be on this side? So just take a moment, think about that, and then we'll continue on. Okay, so hopefully you recognize that ATP is going to be on the left-hand side where the reactants are, because ATP has a higher amount of energy than ADP. ADP over here has a lower amount of energy. And so ATP is going to be on the reactant side, ADP is going to be on the product side. So it goes from an area of high bond energy, whenever that bond's being broken right here, ATP to ADP, and then you form ADP plus another phosphate. Now what catalyzes this reaction? Well, a friendly chemical that you and I know of as H2O, or water. All right, H2O or water, known as hydrolysis, what happens is it breaks up that ATP into ADP and phosphate. So those are the chemicals there. There's your ATP. Notice you have 1, 2, 3 phosphates with your ribose and your adenine group right there. And on this side you have your adenine, your ribose, and then your 2 phosphates on this side. This process is actually what happens in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, you are taking ATP or stored energy and you're breaking it apart and using that ATP to form new chemicals and store in new bonds, which we'll talk about as glucose or sugars in photosynthesis here. So going back, showing you the cycle of it. Remember we said that you have ATP, the phosphates removed, that releases energy. That's an exothermic reaction. So exothermic. Exothermic reaction. And it forms energy and ADP. Now let's take a look at another reaction. So now this reaction, you have the reactants on the left-hand side have a low amount of energy, and the products on the right-hand side, still reactants on the left, products on the right, have a higher amount of energy. So tell me now, where would you place the ATP and the ADP? And I'll give you just a moment to think about that. Okay, so hopefully you said ADP is going to be on the left and ATP is going to be on the right. Now remember, ATP has higher amounts of bond energy, so that's going to be over here on the right hand side. ADP is actually going to be on the left because it has a lower amount of energy. And remember, we're going from a chemical that has a lower amount of energy to one that has a higher amount of energy. This is something that's known as an endothermic reaction. All right, endothermic reaction, because energy is being absorbed. Energy is being absorbed, and the amount of energy that's being absorbed here is the difference between this part right here and that part right there. So you have energy that's being absorbed and it's being used to create bonds. And the bonds that we're creating is that bond between that ADP plus that phosphate to make ATP. So, just to kind of show you, there is your ADP on the left, there's 2 phosphates, and then on the right is your ATP. This happens in cell respiration. In cell respiration, we are generating energy molecules. We're creating ATPs. And so this is what we're going to talk about in depth and detail in cell respiration, just to kind of give you a preview. So ATP is connected in both processes. It's connected in both photosynthesis and cell respiration, and it's interconnected and is essential to everything that we do. So this is everything that we're going to talk about in chapter 4, just kind of in one graphic there, but we're going to get into how this happens at the cellular level, you know, looking at the organelles themselves and where this is happening. So this is it for this section, for section 1 of chapter 4. If you need more information about ATP or like to know a little more about it, maybe a little bit wasn't unclear or a little unclear in the video, then